During the months of October, November, and December, after the resignation of Vice President Agnew, the implementation of one of the sections of the 25th Amendment to the Constitution became necessary. It's probably well in discussing this to understand what brought the 25th Amendment about. This amendment was submitted to the states by the Congress during the administration of President Johnson. There are two main features of this amendment. One is to provide for an acting president in the event of the disability of a president. And the other is to provide for the appointment and confirmation of a vice president, but in the event of a vacancy in that office. I was majority leader when this amendment was under consideration in the Congress. The disability portion had been prompted by the fact that President Eisenhower had had 2 heart attacks while President of the United States, at least one of which temporarily disabled him, and to the further fact that Lyndon Johnson had had and Lyndon Johnson had had a massive heart attack while he was in the Senate. The possibility, therefore, of having an acting president was considered extremely serious at that time. There was no vice president during his first term. He had succeeded Jack Kennedy upon his assassination, and there was a certain reaction in the country to the fact that John McCormick was in his 70s and Senator Hayden, President Pro Tem of the Senate, was in his late 80s at the time. A number of members of Congress, particularly in the Senate, younger members, wanted to try to make sure that the acting president would be young, and that should there be a succession, the job could be taken over by a young man. There was no contemplation at the time of any possibility of a succession or a possible succession under the circumstances which existed after the resignation of Vice President Agnew. Tell her to keep people out of here. During the fall of 1973, rumors began to come out that Vice President Agnew was under investigation for certain alleged activities on his part while he was governor of the state of Maryland. These allegations were simultaneously with multiplying allegations about the president's possible participation in the Watergate affair or its cover-up and in the Plumbers incident, some of which allegations indicated that the president might be guilty of crimes and misdemeanors which would justify the initiation of impeachment proceedings. Then on Tuesday, September 25th, about 11 o'clock in the morning, I had a call from Minority Leader Gerald Ford asking if he and Leslie Aarons, the Republican whip, could come and see me. And I told them they could, or told him they could. So shortly thereafter, Mr. Ford and Mr. Aarons came to my office in the Capitol building at H209 and told me that the Vice President wanted to see me and wondered whether if he called me, I would see him. I told them I would. They also told me that the Vice President wanted to know whether I'd had a call from the Attorney General, and that he hoped that he could see me before I took such a call. I told him I had not heard from the Attorney General, but would be glad to see the Vice President. So about 2 o'clock or 2:30 in the afternoon of the 25th of September, I received a call from Vice President Agnew asking for an appointment. And I told him I'd be glad to see him, and we agreed that he should come over at about 3:30 in the afternoon. The Vice President came over at that time and had in his hand a letter which he gave to me and which he asked me to read before we started a discussion. And the letter was dated September 25th, and it read as follows. Dear Mr. Speaker, I respectfully request that the House of Representatives undertake a full inquiry into the charges which have apparently been made against me in the course of an investigation by the United States Attorney for the District of Maryland. This request is made in the dual interest of preserving the constitutional stature of my office and accomplishing my personal vindication. After the most careful study, my counsel have advised me that the Constitution bars a criminal proceeding of any kind, federal or state, county or town, against a president or vice president while he holds office. Accordingly, I cannot acquiesce in any criminal proceeding being lodged against me in Maryland or elsewhere, and I cannot look to any such proceeding for vindication. In these circumstances, I believe it is the right and duty of the Vice President to turn to the House. A closely parallel precedent so suggests. Almost a century and a half ago, Vice President Calhoun was beset with charges of improper participation in the profits of an Army contract made while he had been Secretary of War. On December 29, 1826, he addressed to your body a communication whose eloquent language I can better quote than rival. Quote, "An imperious sense of duty and a sacred regard to the honor of the station which I occupy compel me to approach your body in its high character of grand inquest of the nation. Charges have been made against me of the most serious nature, and which, if true, ought to degrade me from the high station in which I have been placed by the choice of my fellow citizens, and to consign my name to perpetual infamy. In claiming the investigation of the House, I am sensible that under our free and happy institutions, the conduct of public servants is a fair subject of the closest scrutiny and the freest remarks, and that a firm and faithful discharge of duty affords, ordinarily, ample protection against political attacks. But when such attacks assume the character of impeachable offenses and become in some degree official by being placed among the public records, an officer thus assailed, however base the instrument used, if conscious of innocence, can look for refuge only to the hall of the immediate representatives of the people." End quote. Vice President Calhoun concluded that his communication with a challenge to the freest investigation of the House as the only means effectually to repel this premeditated attack. Your body responded at once by establishing a select committee which subpoenaed witnesses and documents, held exhaustive hearings, and submitted a report on February 13, 1827. The report exonerating the Vice President of any wrongdoing was laid on the table, together with minority views even more strongly in his favor, and the accusations were thereby put to rest. Like my predecessor Calhoun, I am the subject of public attacks that may assume the character of impeachable offenses, and thus require urgent investigation by the House as the repository of the sole power of impeachment and the grand inquest of the nation. No investigation in any form or any other form could either substitute for the investigation by the House contemplated by Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5 of the Constitution, or lay to rest in a timely and definitive manner the unfounded charges whose currency unavoidably jeopardizes the functions of my office. The wisdom of the framers of the Constitution in making the House the only proper agency to investigate the conduct of a president or vice president has been borne out by recent events. Since the Maryland investigation became a matter of public knowledge some 7 weeks ago, there has been a constant and ever-broadening stream of rumors, accusations, and speculations aimed at me. I regret to say that the source, in many instances, can have only been the prosecutors themselves. The result has been so to foul the atmosphere that no grand or petty jury could fairly consider this matter on the merits. I therefore respectfully call upon the House to discharge its constitutional obligation. I shall, of course, cooperate fully. As I have said before, I have nothing to hide. I have directed my counsel to deliver forthwith to the clerk of the House all of my original records, of which copies have previously been furnished to the United States Attorney. If there is any other way in which I can be of aid, I am wholly at the disposal of the House. I am confident that, like Vice President Calhoun, I shall be vindicated by the House. Respectfully yours, Spiro T. Agnew. When I had read the letter, I turned to the Vice President and asked him if he would like for me to call in all or a part of the leadership. Would he like to have the minority leader present while we discussed the contents of his letter? He said that he would first like to talk to me. So he discussed with me his situation for several minutes. He said, first of all, that things were constantly cropping up and items were constantly appearing in the newspapers about things concerning him and that he knew about and that he knew no other person in the world knew about except the prosecuting officials. He said there couldn't be any doubt in the world but what those working on the case as prosecutors were leaking information to the press and often out of context. He also said that the Justice Department was leaking information and that he was sure that they were pressing the charges and that they were bent on proceeding against him. But the whole inference was that he was not being given fair treatment, even though they were pressing for indictment, but that everything which was going to the grand jury or had gone to the grand jury was being leaked and made public so that any grand or petty jury living in the vicinity of Baltimore would doubtless contain people who had read all about newspaper accounts of matters which would be given to the grand jury. He seemed to be quite critical of the Justice Department. And he asked me whether I'd heard from the Attorney General, and I told him I had not. And he said, well, this is coming from the Justice Department. I am not going to get a fair deal with the Justice Department, and that's why I'm coming to the Congress. And he said that the White House isn't helping out any. As if I understood the inference of his comments correctly, he felt that the White House was going to let him down, that he was on his own with no help from anyone with whom he had been associated in the administration, at least anyone that he mentioned to me. He did not mention the name of the president, but he did mention the White House. And he said that he thought the Calhoun precedent was such that the Congress could look into the matter in an impartial manner. And he said that he hoped that I would see fit to have a congressional hearing I told him that if we had such a hearing, it would probably be referred to the Committee on the Judiciary, and he indicated that he would prefer a select committee. He said that unless the Congress took the matter up, he was going to be subject to further and continued harassment, and that he was in no position to defend himself against leaks that were coming out every day from the district attorney's office and or the Justice Department. I told him that I would be glad to check into the matter and see what we could or should do. So I asked him if he would mind at that stage of the game if I called in the House parliamentarian who was more familiar with the precedents than I, and who had been parliamentarian in the House since the 1920s and had served as parliamentarian during one or more judicial impeachments, and was familiar with processes and with investigations of officials who, by their office, were subject to impeachment. He said no. So I called in Louis Dashler, the parliamentarian of the House of Representatives, and handed the letter to Lou and asked him to read it. When he read it, he said, "Mr. Vice President, you certainly have made a strong case for the Speaker to consider, and I'm sure he will. I don't know what his verdict will be or words to that effect." The parliamentarian then said that this can either be handled by the Committee on the Judiciary or by a select committee. And the Vice President again expressed his desire that it be handled by a select committee. Then I asked the Vice President if I could call in the leadership of the House. And he said yes, because he had told his story to me and he wanted to do so in private before he talked to the rest of them. So he, with his permission then, I called Congressman Tip O'Neill, the majority leader, and Congressman Gerald Ford, the minority leader, Congressman Les Aarons of Illinois, the minority whip, and Congressman John McFall, the majority whip. I also, since the matter was one that would have to go to the Judiciary Committee, later asked him to come in to the meeting, and Mr. Rodino did come in later. We discussed the matter and went over in general what his request was, and the minority leadership felt that if it were done, it should be done by a select committee. And later, Mr. Rodino expressed some doubts as to whether it should go to a select committee or not. Then, after everybody else left, I talked at length with Mr. Rodino, Congressman Rodino, who is chairman of the Committee on the Judiciary, and his counsel about procedures, and asked them to make a study of the matter and to get back with me the next day, and that I would, in the meantime, think about the matter myself. So, but prior to that time, the Vice President had left. And not long after the Vice President had left, I received a telephone call from Elliot Richardson, the Attorney General. And I have a feeling that he knew at that time that the Vice President had been to my office, although I'm not sure of this. Nobody told me that. But the Vice President had already indicated, and Congressman Foote had already indicated, that I would probably receive a call from the Attorney General. And I might say parenthetically that before deciding the case, I had intended to call the Attorney General and to try to cover up my flanks with any information that he had, and if necessary, to call the United States Attorney in Baltimore, who was handling the case. Well, Vice President Agnew had not been gone from my office very long until I did receive this call from the Attorney General. And he said to me, I thought I ought to call you and tell you that that we are submitting charges against the Vice President to the grand jury in Baltimore tomorrow. And in my judgment, he will be indicted. And I said, well, is there any suggestion that you want to make to me? And he said, no, I just thought you ought to have this information. So I felt sure that the Vice President had known in advance that he was going to call, and I never have completely figured out what had happened. I had later learned that Congressman Ford and Congressman Ahrens had been to the White House, and I assumed that they had seen the Vice President or had been called by the Vice President. And it appeared that shortly after that they called me, and I wasn't sure whether this was something that had been cooked up in the White House or not. I didn't know whether the whole group were wanting the House of Representatives to try to get the whole matter over into the House, or whether the Vice President and they were really at odds. And I got from the Vice President the impression that they were. Well, the Vice President left, and Rodino and I did talk more, and we had another meeting the next morning with him and his counsel in my office. And and what Rodino and I did and his counsel was discuss the precedents. We went over various points. One, should the House look into this matter at this stage of the game? And two, if the House should look into the matter at this stage of the game, should it be handled by a select committee appointed for this one purpose, or should it be handled by the Judiciary Committee, which would have jurisdiction? We thought a whole lot about the matter. We knew that the Vice President was in difficulty, and that he was a very troubled man, although he seemed to me in his conversation to be a very confident and aggressive person, because he said he was not going to let them kick him around. He was going to fight them back, and he manifested his typical attitude of being ready to take them on. And I thought he was. He certainly was a lot more confident and composed when he talked to me than he was in his radio his last television appearance after his resignation. So, after we had been over these matters, Pete Rodino and I considered that the fact that this matter was before the courts put a new wrinkle on it, and that the situation was in that respect very different from the Calhoun case. If we were to take this matter over and indictable evidence was available to a grand jury, we would be giving the Vice President an out. And we did not foreclose the possibility of having a hearing with the Vice President, either with his consent or otherwise, at some later date, depending on what happened. But we called in the leadership of the Democratic side, and all of them agreed that the best route was for us not to get involved in it because it was in the courts. And it was, we started to write up a new statement. We had written several, covering every different aspect as to what we'd do if we decided on this course or that. And then we decided that it should be very succinct, and it should simply state the position and drop it at that. And the report that I issued was in 2 sentences, or the statement that I issued was in 2 sentences, and I issued it at my press conference on September 26th, 1973, and it read, "The Vice President's letter relates to matters before the courts. In view of that fact, I, as Speaker, will not take any action on this matter at this time." Well, let's quit for that.
Okay.
Is that a place to stop?
Yeah.
Is that all right up to there, you think?
Sure.
I think we can
Yeah.
get,
We'll
I'm
just
just remembering is